Houston.
40 years ago, on a hot August morning, this was ground zero, 1,900 feet above where I'm standing in Hiroshima, Japan. An event took place that changed human history. One bomb, 10 feet long and 28 inches round, exploded with the force of 13,000 tons of TNT. That was more than 1,000 times more powerful than any previous bomb. It was an atomic bomb, the first used in anger. For half a mile around, there was total destruction. There were roughly 300,000 people in Hiroshima at the time. 70 to 80,000 people were killed, and a like number injured. Tens of thousands more died of after effects. The atomic bomb that exploded here and the one at Nagasaki changed not only warfare, but the relationships between men and nations. In this next hour, we will look at how the United States since 1945 has coped with the dangers, suspicions, and fears that have fueled a nuclear arms race, but so far, have kept those weapons from being used.
This portion of CBS Reports is sponsored by Sun Company. At Sun, we believe putting our energy back into the community is just as important as getting it out. Where there's sun, there's energy.
Under this snow, there's more oil than in Saudi Arabia. 20 years ago, Sun Company developed a process to get oil from tar sands. Since then, a lot's developed around here. Jobs, a community, hockey teams. The energy's not just under the snow, it's everywhere, even on the ice. At Sun, we think that putting our energy back into a community is just as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
Come on, girl, come on.
To help your dog live a longer, happier life, give her a good home, lots of love, and Purina Dog Chow.
Come on. Come on. Misty, I love you.
Purina Dog Chow brand dog food, helping dogs live longer lives.
Only twice in history have nuclear weapons been used: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, the weapons are even more devastating, and the whole world fears they may be used again. How close have we come to using them again in the 40 years since Hiroshima? In this broadcast, we will tell that story through those who have had to deal firsthand with nuclear weapons. We begin with the man who commanded the plane that dropped the first bomb. August 1945, this B-29, the Enola Gay, now in a hangar outside of Washington, will carry the atomic bomb to Hiroshima. Colonel Paul Tibbets will be the pilot and group commander.
I said to myself, there is just no way that anybody can stand up to a weapon like that. And with that thought in mind, I was convinced that I would get it to the target and that we would be successful and we'd bring the war to a halt, thereby saving many lives. I recognize the other side of the story, too. Many lives have to be lost, but on the other hand, that's the price of war.
At Los Alamos, scientists like Dr. Harold Agnew, who would later become director of the laboratory, have been working on two different approaches to a bomb.
The uranium device was the little boy here. This particular device used enriched uranium, which was in very limited supply. And that's why essentially we only had one of these. The Hiroshima bomb was essentially the only bomb we had available using this material. The plutonium was used in the Fat Man, which was used at Trinity first to test out the theory and the practicability of the implosion system, which proved to be very feasible, and then it was subsequently used at Nagasaki.
Back in 1944, however, the initial plan is to drop atomic bombs both on Germany and Japan. Tibbets says the German strike would have come from an air base in the Adriatic.
My directive at the time that I put this outfit together was, you will organize and train this outfit and be prepared for a split operation. Those were the words that General Ent gave me. Split operation. Simultaneous drops in Europe and Japan.
May 1945. With Germany out of the war, President Truman and his top military aides focus on where to drop the bombs in Japan. John J. McCloy, then Assistant Secretary of War, participates at some of these key meetings.
They were talking about what they call shock action. And the reason they wanted shock action was to bring about a surrender, and that's why they chose a spot that was close to civilian population. They deliberately chose Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Tibbets moves his B-29 unit to Tinian, and on August 5th, 1945, the first atomic bomb is rolled out of its assembly shed. Some scientists and officials are opposed to dropping a bomb on Japan without a warning. John McCloy.
And I said, I think we ought to say to them, we have the keys to the bomb and the delivery of the bomb. We have no alternative, Mr. Japan, or whoever we talk to, we have no alternative whatever. But to drop this on you unless you surrender.
McGeorge Bundy was co-author of Secretary of War Henry Stimson's memoirs.
They were unable to propose a demonstration that they thought would be effective. And anyway, they weren't themselves sure it would work. Who wants to show off a flop?
After a bomb is tested in the United States, a new idea is sent to Tinian. Just before releasing the bomb, drop a dummy carrying a super powerful siren. People on the ground will look up. When the bomb bursts, nobody within a radius of 5 miles could look directly at the gadget and retain his eyesight. The idea is discarded.
One day before we took off, Tokyo Rose came on and welcomed the Black Arrow Squadron and told us that she knew and the Japanese knew what we were there for and who we were. And I was very much surprised the next morning to find that our strike aircraft and the group of 3 had their tail symbols all changed. And we had triangles and circles with letters on them, just the same as the rest of the aircraft out there.
And all of our procedures started in the afternoon when we loaded the bomb, and then we went through the normal routine that one goes through to getting rest and coming in, getting crew briefing, and then final briefing and all that sort of thing. At that time, the word atomic was not used, but we said, now here is what you can expect to see. This weapon that we're going to use will do basically what was done at Alamogordo in the test. Obviously, it was dramatic, if I may say that.
At exactly 8:15 on the morning of August 6th, the bomb is dropped, and 43 seconds later, it explodes.
When I turned around and I got a look at that, what had been the city down there was nothing but a black boiling pallor of, I called it tar, but it was smoke, debris, dust, and everything. It was bubbling, it was just boiling.
Harold Agnew is in the scientific plane over Hiroshima alongside the Enola Gay.
We were in the back of the airplane watching our instruments, so we actually didn't see the detonation. But when the flash actually occurred, it completely lit up the compartment in which we were, which was in the aft part of the aircraft. Subsequently, we experienced the shock from the blast of the explosion. That was something we'd worried about because we had no idea what the effect would be on the airplane. But it felt as if you were in an ash can, I guess, and somebody gave you 2 good kicks.
I did what I was told to do, and I have to add this, I have no regrets of doing what I did at that particular time. And I've never lost a night's sleep over it.
In true government fashion, a receipt has been signed for the nuclear material in the bomb. Quote, the above material was expended to the city of Hiroshima, end quote. 2 days later, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, is rolled out. Bernard O'Keefe was an ensign in the Navy and a radar expert working on the bomb.
People were training for the invasion just a few weeks away, and many of these people just figured they only had a few weeks to live, the idea of not dropping a second bomb would have been considered madness. And it was scheduled to go 6 days later, originally 10 days later. They cut it back to 6, and then we were told to work around the clock to get it back to 4 days.
And when the bomb was being loaded and being prepared, essentially everyone that had been involved in working on the project signed their names and the names of their families on the bombs.
The Nagasaki bomb has its firing system in its nose, the radar in its tail. The night before it's set to go, Bernard O'Keefe finds that the connecting cable has been put in backwards.
Now, if I did what I should do, I would call the major in, who was in charge, and say, Major, this cable's been put in backwards. You'll have to get out the assembly crew and take the whole thing apart, which I was sure would take at least 24 hours. So I was sitting there, and along came a major, and he hit me with this biggest cliche you can ever get. He whacked me on the back of the neck, and he said, "Get off your ass, O'Keefe, you're holding up the war." So I got my technician, and we propped open the doors, and we got two 50-foot extension cords, which were forbidden because there were no electrical outlets, and I unsoldered the cable connector at this end, and then I went around very carefully around these 64 very sensitive detonators with my soldering iron, which could have set them off, and disconnected the cable on that connector on that end, and I reversed them, and I soldered up the wires again, and I put up the connectors, and when the major came back, he said, "Are you all finished?" And I said, "Yes, sir, it's all done, ready to go."
A B-29 called Boxcar with the second bomb aboard takes off at 3 a.m. on August 9th in a rainstorm with its auxiliary gas tank clogged. Its primary target, Kokura, is clouded over. Running short of gas, it heads for Nagasaki with only enough fuel for one bombing run. At the last moment, the clouds break and the bomb is dropped.
I think most of our thoughts were on the immediate effects. Would it end the war?
Caspar Weinberger, later to become Defense Secretary, is an officer on General MacArthur's staff in Manila working on invasion plans.
And, I think nobody really felt that a single bomb could do that, but after the second bomb was dropped, then it became quite clear that it could have that effect. It could end the war. But I also did think later, at about the same time, what a tremendously important thing it was for the United States, because in these plans for the invasion of Japan, we had pretty well written off the first 4 waves of American troops. And one of those waves was in the division in which I had previously served. And so I had a rather personal interest.
August 15th, 1945, Japan surrenders. The 2 atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki have killed 125,000 and wounded 150,000.
These proceedings are closed.
From all over the world, crude oil comes to this Sun Company refinery where we make Sunoco products. Since Sun produces nearly 10 million gallons of gasoline a day, one of the most important jobs we have is safety, and not just at work. Many of us use our safety training as volunteer firemen in our community. All right, you guys, let's go. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the community is just as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
Your days go by fast. Your work never seems to end.
That's why we stand behind Whirlpool Appliances with Cool Line telephone service to help with questions, our do-it-yourself repair manuals, and our national network of franchise tech care service outlets. Whirlpool Quality Appliances.
We're making your world a little easier.
Whirlpool makes it easier for you.
Look at the tomato, Vincent.
To make really fresh-tasting spaghetti sauce, pick really fresh vegetables.
And this pepper.
Or pick Ragu Chunky Garden-Style Spaghetti Sauce, the chunkiest, freshest tasting sauce we ever put in a jar. Thick with chunks of garden-ripe tomatoes and vegetables.
This is sauce.
For really fresh taste, pick Ragu Chunky Garden Style in 2 new varieties. That's Italian.
My daughter said, "Oh my gosh, Mama, tornado."
Allstate update. Fast, fair claim service. Anna and Leanne Williams were rescued from under the rubble of what had been their home.
I feel luckier than some folks because I called Allstate, and within a week I had my settlement, and so that just makes you feel great.
Allstate promises that you're in good hands, and it's true.
If people say it's just a saying, I know different.
You're in good hands with Allstate, a member of the Sears Financial Network.
He's a detective with 3 ex-wives who are his reluctant partners in solving crimes. Premiering Wednesday, August 14th on CBS, I Had 3 Wives.
Peter finds love on every first date. Finds friends easy to keep. Seems like Peter finds life a party, but something's still missing for him in hometown.
Barbara always looks like she just stepped out of a high-fashion magazine. But the perfect picture is going to change for Barbara in hometown.
January 1946, World War II is over. President Truman has asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff for their views on atomic weapons. No other nation has them. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Army Chief of Staff, responds. If we were ruthlessly realistic, we would not permit any foreign power, other than an ally, to make nuclear weapons. If we saw a country beginning, we would destroy its capacity to make them. Bromley Smith has served in the White House under 4 presidents: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson.
The Air Force had, of course, dropped the 2 bombs, and they conceived of the weapon as theirs. The Navy wanted a piece of it for its submarines and other ways of delivering it. The Army certainly wanted it on the ground, atomic artillery, and yet, for example, nobody knew what would happen.
June 1948. The Allies decide to supply West Berlin by air when the Soviets close off land access. President Truman considers his nuclear options.
One of the constraints against using the atomic weapons in the Berlin crisis was the reaction of the British, including Mr. Churchill. Also, a reluctance to do anything that might foreclose in the future our use of those bases. The reason they were not used was because the urgency of the situation more or less dissipated.
A year later, September 1949, American planes flying off the Soviet coast collect radioactive debris proving Russia has exploded an atomic device.
The Russians began to work on nuclear weapons sometime in the war, 42, 43 perhaps. They knew that we were working on it through espionage.
Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist, passes American nuclear secrets to the Soviets. At Los Alamos, Fuchs has done the first analysis of the yields of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs.
I always found that very interesting because he was a very nice, quiet, mild individual, liked to babysit for people. And at the same time, evidently, he had been feeding this information to foreign power.
Stalin is reported by the best accounts we have to have been absolutely determined from the moment he had the news of Hiroshima that he must have the weapon, saying to his subordinates, and especially to Kurchatov, the great Soviet nuclear physicist, comrades, get me a bomb. The Americans have upset the equilibrium.
Spring 1953, Korea. Once again, the use of nuclear weapons is considered, this time by Dwight Eisenhower.
In the early days of the Eisenhower administration, President Eisenhower asked the military to consider whether it would be feasible to use these atomic weapons in
digging the Chinese communists out of some of the caves that they were in Korea.
And how serious was he? He didn't mind at all conveying the message that it could happen. But he never came anywhere near facing the judgment in Korea, or indeed anywhere else, that this was something he was prepared to order.
Richard Nixon, then vice president, remembers.
Eisenhower, however, was very canny. He did not disclose to his cabinet or to the Security Council that he was going to send a message to the North Koreans, to the Chinese, and particularly to the Russians. The way he did it was to authorize Secretary Dulles to inform Krishna Menon, the Indian foreign minister, who was on good terms with both China and Russia, that our patience was worn thin, that we are not going to be involved in a land war there, and that we were prepared to use nuclear weapons if necessary to bring the war to a conclusion. The message got through. The truce came about as a result.
Despite Eisenhower's restraint in Korea, the 1950s see a major increase in nuclear weapons and reduced spending for conventional forces.
In the 50s, clearly we had what we considered to be a monopoly. People had just gotten over World War II, and I think the idea that these weapons could be used on the battlefield was much more prevalent then than it is today. There wasn't the what if that confronts us today. People, I would say, were much more cavalier about the use of weapons then. Fortunately, they were never used.
In the late 1950s, the Strategic Air Command keeps bombers on airborne alert. Some carry a 20-megaton bomb.
This is the Mark 17 bomb. It was our first thermonuclear bomb. It was carried on alert by the B-36 aircraft. It had a yield 1,000 times greater than that of the Hiroshima bomb, weighed about 20 tons.
At the same time, American nuclear weapons are sent overseas, not to be used without U.S. approval.
Yet they were being carried with NATO aircraft. For instance, there'd be a German aircraft that had a U.S. bomb on it and a German pilot. Now, standing there to prevent him from using it was a poor GI that stood there 4 or 8 hours a day with a rifle. Now, here he was in a foreign country, completely surrounded by foreign nationals, yet it was his job, in theory, to stop this person from using that bomb if the person decided to do it and hadn't been authorized to do so.
Agnew recommends that locks called permissive action links, PALs, be put on the weapons to prevent use without presidential authorization.
We removed from them the ability to use the weapon unless they had something transmitted to them which enabled them to use the weapon. Now, as you can appreciate, at the time, the military opposed this. They felt it was a reflection on their integrity that anyone would put in, let's say, a lock that would prevent them from using the weapons.
In 1960, the first of 15 Jupiter missiles are sent to Turkey. They are destined to become a pawn in the coming Cuban Missile Crisis.
Missiles in Turkey were foolishness. The decision to put them there was taken in the latter part of the Eisenhower administration over very considerable skepticism expressed at the time in private documents by the president himself, by Eisenhower. Because Eisenhower knew they were not very good weapons. They were first-generation weapons. They were liquid-fueled. They were unreliable. They were vulnerable as hell. They were inaccurate.
In 1961, John Kennedy comes to the White House determined to make good on a campaign promise to close the missile gap. His Secretary of Defense is Robert McNamara.
Of course, as it developed, there wasn't any missile gap. Or rather, there was a gap, but it was the reverse of what had been thought. The numerical superiority was on the order of 6,000 strategic U.S. warheads, mostly bombs, versus roughly 200 Soviet warheads.
At the same time, Kennedy is given casualty estimates should war break out.
President Kennedy found that under the best of circumstances, the U.S. could expect to sustain 20 million deaths.
Harold Brown, then Pentagon Director of Research, later Secretary of Defense.
The Soviet Union, under those circumstances, might expect to sustain many, many more. But 20 million was a large enough number so that President Kennedy recognized that nuclear war was not something that could be considered just another kind of war.
June 1961. Kennedy meets Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna for the first time. Khrushchev is not impressed. Arkady Shevchenko is the highest-ranking Soviet diplomat to defect to the United States.
After the Vienna meeting, and that I know also from the first hand, because even I heard Khrushchev himself telling that Kennedy is a weak president, that he is not a strong man, that, that he will not dare to do something.
In August, Khrushchev puts Kennedy to the test, another Soviet threat to cut off West Berlin.
In this case, they saw a weakness, and they apparently moved to take advantage of it. Now, what did they do? They were going to move to take over West Berlin.
McNamara calls in a senior officer and says, "We are not going to give up West Berlin." Now, how do we respond?
To each Soviet action, he suggested a NATO response, and at the end he said, and then, of course, we'll have to use nuclear weapons. I couldn't believe it, but that was his statement.
McNamara confers with Lord Mountbatten, then chief of the British Defense Staff.
He suggested a response to each one of the Soviet actions, and at the end he hadn't mentioned the use of nuclear weapons. I said, Lord Mountbatten, you haven't mentioned nuclear weapons. He said, are you insane?
Khrushchev backs down, but is still concerned about a U.S. first strike capability. He counters by moving his missiles into Cuba.
It was much easier for the Soviet Union to deploy in Cuba medium-range missiles which can really reach American territory. They were much more cheaper. I mean, rather to embark on long-range, very costly programs, of creating sophisticated intercontinental missiles in the Soviet Union and deploy them.
I recall clearly it was a Monday morning. We received quite startling information. We had U-2 photographs of Soviet intermediate range missiles on the soil of Cuba. That was the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
At a high-level meeting with the president, McNamara maintains that while the military balance has not changed, the missiles must be forced out.
There must be some major reason for the Russians to set this up. Must be that they're not satisfied with their ICBMs. That would be the reason if they would. But given this time where it makes a launching base for a short-range missile against the United States to supplement their rather defective ICBM system.
The first alternative was a surgical airstrike followed by, almost surely, by a land invasion. The other alternative was, I'm going to call a political alternative. We would use that naval force to quarantine Cuba, to state to the Soviet Union we would not allow any further offensive weapons to be introduced into Cuba by the Soviet Union. We would insist further that they remove the weapons that were there.
U.S. intelligence says that 20 missiles are carrying nuclear warheads.
We thought it very unlikely that the Soviet political leaders, Khrushchev and his Politburo, would authorize the launch, even in the face of a U.S. attack. However, we thought it entirely possible, even probable, that a Soviet commander or soldier on the spot, seeing his weapons subject to immediate destruction, would without authority launch. Even the loss one would, let's say, directed at Miami or New York or Washington, might have killed 1 million or 2 million people. That was something that a responsible president didn't wish to expose his nation to and was determined not to.
October 22nd, Kennedy decides on the quarantine option. Simultaneously, SAC goes on the highest alert in its history.
What it meant was that we kept in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, bombers loaded with nuclear weapons, capable of being instructed by radio to proceed without landing, to proceed to the Soviet Union and bomb the Soviet Union. Now that, of course, was never intended. It was a precautionary move.
The quarantine catches Khrushchev by surprise.
It was a big embarrassment. And he was embarrassed, and he understood that there was a lot of people who warned him that he should not do that. They were right, both in the military and the civilian. It was a beginning of the end for sure.
Kennedy, concerned about U.S. missiles in Turkey, orders them disarmed.
It was also a consideration that something might happen to those missiles and they might be launched without authority from the United States. That if they were, and the Russians attacked the Turks, then the provisions of the NATO treaty came into effect and we would be in instantaneous general war.
The president's brother is holding secret meetings with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin.
The Soviets, in the back channel communications that were carried on by Robert Kennedy with Ambassador Dobrynin and on to Moscow, had stated at one point that as a condition for removing their missiles from Cuba, they would insist that we remove certain of our missiles, in particular the missiles in Turkey, from Turkey.
Two messages from Khrushchev, one moderate, one very tough. No missiles come out of Cuba until you take yours out of Turkey. October 27th, the U-2 was shot down over Cuba. That same day, McNamara at a top national security meeting at the White House. We must now be ready to attack Cuba. Invasion had become almost inevitable.
And I recall leaving the White House that night, Saturday evening, walking through the gardens of the White House to my car to drive back to the Pentagon and wondering if I'd ever see another Saturday night.
And we sit there stewing over what to do. Are we going to lose a decent agreement, a fair one, a good one, gets the missiles out of Cuba, because we don't dare say in public what we've been saying in private for a year and a half, that these damn missiles in Turkey make no sense? So we decided to do it by a private assurance.
Again, Bobby Kennedy sees Dobrynin, tells him,
But it may interest you to know that the president is determined that those weapons will be out of there if this matter can be successfully resolved. If you ever breathe a word of it, that won't happen. And that's what did happen. The Soviets did keep quiet. The missiles came out.
Two crisis management tools emerged from Cuba: permissive action links, PALs, locks on all but sub-launch missiles to prevent unauthorized firings, and the hotline linking Washington and Moscow.
What we learned in the missile crisis was that the absence of a hotline could be dangerous.
In the summer of 1963, a ban against atmospheric tests like this is signed by both sides.
This is the Mark 53 warhead. It's the largest warhead we've carried on our missiles. It came into the stockpile in the mid-60s. It's presently on our Titan missiles and will be soon retired.
And the arms race continues.
People get a lot of fish out of these waters, and Sun Company gets a lot of oil. Over 3 million barrels a year. We know that sea life was here long before we were.
This is a drill.
That's why we have practice drills like this. In case of a spill, our containment unit would quickly surround the oil and help prevent damage. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the environment is as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
Want a good reason why my antacid is Tums? I'll give you 3. 1, Tums is effective. It neutralizes 1/3 more stomach acid than the other leading brand. And that's what I take an antacid for. 2, sodium. I don't want any. And Tums is sodium-free. 3, Tums is rich in calcium. And to me, an extra source of calcium is extra good news.
Tonight, Lindsay Wagner was everything a mom's supposed to be until her tragic death changed everything.
No!
And Ricky Schroeder was left with half a family, a father he hardly knew, and a need to blame someone.
You know, you really stink. I hate you being my father!
Can they find the strength and understanding to rebuild their family? 2 kinds of love.
This is CBS.
Hamburger ketchup. Hamburger ketchup. Hamburger ketchup. Hamburger ketchup. Hamburger ketchup. Hamburger ketchup.
Hamburger Miracle Whip salad dressing.
Hamburger what? Hamburger what?
Hamburger what? Hamburger what? Miracle Whip.
Hamburgers with a tangy zip of Miracle Whip salad dressing. The bread spread makes anything on bread taste better.
Hamburger Miracle Whip. Hamburger Miracle Whip. Hamburger Miracle Whip.
Hamburger Miracle Whip.
Hamburger Miracle Whip. Hamburger Miracle Whip. Change mine to Miracle Whip. Change yours to Miracle Whip. Change mine to Miracle Whip.
Houstonians want an inside look when the front pages are splashed with a major world crisis, hijackers, hostages, hostility. Into this chaos, the Chronicle sent reporter Rebecca Trounson to report back to us her own impressions, minute by minute, because you deserve an intimate look at the news, no matter where, no matter what. Only from Houston's leading information source, the Chronicle.
Terrorist retaliation tonight at 10.
A regional conflict again threatens a confrontation between the nuclear superpowers on June 5, 1967. Israel attacks Egypt. When U.S. warships in the Mediterranean move east, Soviet President Alexei Kosygin uses the hotline for the first time.
The message was a very, very tough message, and it essentially said, we've observed what you've done. And they interpreted this as a move on our part not to preserve the independence of Israel, but to attack the Arabs and utterly defeat them. And the Soviets said in the message, as I recall it, if you want war, you'll have war. And I think it was very important that the hotline permitted this communication because we, in effect, replied, we don't want war, but we will act in ways that will ensure the survival of Israel. Now, that can be accomplished. Neither one of us will be involved in war. And ultimately, that, of course, was accomplished.
When the U.S. intelligence ship Liberty is mistakenly hit by Israeli planes and ships, U.S. planes move into the area, and President Johnson uses the hotline.
This was to inform the Russians that these airplanes were in the Mediterranean and they were on a course of action that probably affected the radar in Moscow and probably caused them some concern that we were either heading their direction or that we were entering the war and going to attack the Egyptians.
The Six-Day War ends without the superpowers becoming involved militarily. In June 1967 in Glassboro, New Jersey, Johnson and Kosygin meet face-to-face. The U.S. wants to limit offensive missiles, is concerned that the Soviets are building a defensive anti-missile system around Moscow. The president tells McNamara to explain U.S. concerns to Kosygin.
I said, Mr. Prime Minister, if you proceed to continue to deploy your anti-ballistic missile system, we will be forced to expand our offensive force. We must maintain a deterrent. To do so, we've got to expand this offensive force. He became red in the face. He pounded the table. He shouted at me. He said, defense is moral, offense is immoral. Now, I think he believed it. This was not an act. But the point of the story is that today the situation is exactly reversed. It is we today who are talking about deploying a defensive system in association with our offensive system. And it is they who are saying, we will have only one response. We must expand our offensive force.
When the Soviets clashed with the Chinese along their border in 1969, Marshal Andrei Grechko has an idea, a nuclear strike against the Chinese.
Not to start a nuclear war, but just to give them a lesson and to show that they have to be careful. What he meant was that, to try to have a limited nuclear strike and to destroy, let's say, a few of their nuclear facilities and perhaps a couple of cities. That was his idea, which was not accepted by the Politburo, and civilian leadership proved to be much more careful and cautious.
October 1973, a Middle East war again threatens a U.S.-Soviet confrontation. In the midst of Watergate, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev cables President Nixon. James Schlesinger is Secretary of Defense.
And in that cable, Mr. Brezhnev indicated, in light of the presumed atmosphere of détente, that the United States and the Soviet Union should move into the Middle East together and to settle the problems of the Middle East, establish a kind of condominium. That touched off, needless to say, a note of alarm, because he indicated that unless he had our concurrence, that he was going to move Soviet forces into the Middle East. We had every intelligence indicator that those Soviet forces were beginning to move.
U.S. intelligence reports a Soviet freighter heading for Egypt with radioactive cargo. Analysts say it could be warheads.
The Soviet Union had, to that point, been very careful about moving any nuclear weapons outside of the Soviet Union itself. This was a considerable change in the pattern of Soviet behavior, and therefore tended to tell us that the Soviets were indeed politically serious when they made these suggestions.
U.S. forces worldwide are put on alert. Defense Condition 3, DEFCON 3.
That includes the full weight of all of America's capabilities. And at that time, it included 1,054 ICBMs. It brought the bombers up to a alert status. It included approximately 400 SLBMs that were at sea at the time.
The reason that we went on the alert was that we knew that if we did not stop their intervention, that then we would be faced with the necessity of intervening ourselves in order to stop them. We knew that if that happened, and if the United States and the Soviet Union became involved in a conflict in that area, it would inevitably escalate to the nuclear level.
Secretary of State Henry Kissinger wants the alert kept secret.
Dr. Kissinger, as you may recall, liked secret diplomacy, and he had said at that meeting, "There will be no leak of this, will there?" And Admiral Mura, whom I'm sure was just teasing him, said, "Of course there will be no leak, Henry." Well, the next morning, at about 7:30, I received an very angry phone call from Dr. Kissinger, who said, "It's all out. It's all out. I've just heard on a radio broadcast that all of our forces have been put on alert. I thought you were going to keep this secret." And I said, "There's no way that you can keep this secret when you put 2 million people around the world on alert."
And Soviets immediately, realized and understood that their threat to go ahead unilaterally if United States will not join in the joint operation could lead to a nuclear war. And the choice was whether what is more important for the Soviet Union, to face a risk of a nuclear war or to save Egypt. This was a choice. And the choice definitely was that forget Egypt and avoiding a risk of the nuclear war.
In less than 24 hours, Brezhnev accepts a UN peacekeeping force in the Mideast without U.S. or Soviet troops.
We must remember, though, that the United States had unquestioned superiority. We were looking down their throats. The possibility of retaliation was minimal. The Yom Kippur War may have been the last time that the United States will be able to use nuclear weapons diplomatically.
Jimmy Carter's presidency is free of eyeball-to-eyeball showdowns with the Soviets, but Carter does draw a hard line in the Persian Gulf.
When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, abandoning a fairly long-standing policy of using surrogates to take military action and put their own troops into that country, about 100,000 troops, I thought it was imperative that we let the Soviets know that they could not go through Iran or Pakistan and threaten the Persian Gulf region and all its oil fields and the Arab countries there who were our friends, that if they did make a strike toward the Persian Gulf region, that we would consider this to be a direct threat to our security, and that we would have to take steps accordingly.
So the two superpowers continue to treat each other with great caution, while their arsenals and destructive power continue to grow.
The Congress today is authorizing the production of additional weapons. There are now 50,000 warheads, roughly 25,000 Soviet, 25,000 U.S., 50,000 warheads in existence because they are thought of as weapons. And yet, I think I can say without any contradiction that there is no piece of paper in the world that shows how either the Soviets or the U.S., Warsaw Pact or NATO, can initiate the use of these warheads with advantage to itself. They are militarily useless. They have no military purpose whatsoever, no military use whatsoever, excepting only to deter one's opponents from their use. And we surely don't need 50,000 for that purpose.
This is the Mark 12A, the modern MIRV warhead for the Minuteman. This particular warhead had the same weight and same size as the previous warhead, but had double the explosive yield.
And the arms race continues.
Through the centuries, a wine has evolved with a unique taste, the taste of selected European vinifera grapes. A taste so incredibly delicious it wins awards year after year, every year. A taste that has won the hearts of more people than any other imported wine in history. Riuniti on ice, so nice. If you haven't tried Riuniti, you don't know what you're missing.
Jell-O brand gelatin pops presents The Little Rascals.
Try the pop that tastes like fruit. It's soft and blue.
What's the rocket?
We're writing a jingle, Dad. For Jell-O Gelatin Pop.
What's that?
It's the fruity taste of Jell-O gelatin, whipped smooth and frozen, and just 35 calories.
Pretty fruity, huh? Refreshing, huh?
I'll buy a box.
I'm all the way stop singing.
Sold.
Jell-O gelatin pops.
They're the tops.
Up in the Rockies, I found a place where people really take pride in their craft.
My granddad made these.
They're beauties.
Want to see how they're made? Got some hot coffee on.
That's good coffee.
At Maxwell House. Decaffeinated.
If a decaffeinated coffee tastes this good, good to the last drop, it couldn't be anything but Maxwell House. Looks like you got a customer.
Oh, that's my granddad. He's just checking up.
You couldn't be anything but Maxwell House.
They call this cattle country. It's also where a lot of America's coal is. So when Sun Company built the Cordero mine here, folks worried about the future of the land. But Sun also developed this land reclamation center to make sure the land is properly restored. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the land is just as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
West 57. Where on earth is West 57? For these four reporters, it's anywhere a good story takes them. West 57 premieres Tuesday, August 13th.
Got a problem? Are the odds against you? When you've run out of options, there's someone you can turn to. The Equalizer. He just may be your last alternative. Trust me.
What have we learned in the 40 years since Hiroshima? We put the question to the men who, at one time or another, have had to live very close to the bomb.
The very fact that we both have nuclear weapons in such great numbers means that we both know how destructive they will be to each of us. So that is not going to happen. I also do not believe that the danger that we confront, a major danger, is that the Soviet Union is going to try to atomize Western Europe. We have to remember, they want to dominate Western Europe. They want to dominate the world. But the men in the Kremlin are not madmen, and they're not fools. They do not want a Europe that has been atomized. They don't want a United States that has been destroyed. They want to win without war.
I don't have any doubt that in Moscow and in Washington, no matter who is in the leadership role, there's this constant awareness that we must avoid a direct military confrontation with the other superpower because of the high possibility that it could escalate into a nuclear exchange.
I would not ignore the effect of nuclear terror as a deterrent to conventional war. I think it's been real. I think it has contributed to the caution which both the U.S. and the Soviet Union have shown when it's come to the possibility of engaging each other's military forces.
It depends entirely, of course, on the restraint, but also on the perception by the Soviets that they would face, if they made such a strike, that they would face a retaliatory capability by the United States that would be able to inflict on them damage they couldn't accept.
They do understand that even if the Soviet Union would first strike, still United States will have enough retaliatory capability to strike back and to destroy Moscow, Leningrad, major, industrial centers in the Soviet Union. That is something which is no leadership can accept.
One of America's leading scientists in 1946 or 47 said, "What happens when Swaziland gets the bomb?" It shows the appropriate concern, but an excessive note of alarm at the same time. The pace of spread has been slow, but it is coming. And so I fear that if we do ever see a nuclear weapon used in anger, it is likely to be in the third world.
Both the United States and the Soviet Union, we don't want these nuclear weapons to be proliferated all over the world because some nut like Gaddafi, might set off the whole world down in that part of the area.
We've talked about two kinds of judgments. One, those made by political leaders thinking seriously about the risk that a nuclear war might actually happen on their own watch. And what we have seen, what I believe I see looking back, is that they have been notably prudent and careful when they face that question. I don't think we can be as comfortable about the kinds of choices that they have made, or at least approved, in the procurement and deployment of weapon systems, which create reciprocal fears and a continuing competition.
Nuclear weapons cannot be uninvented. In my own judgment, the prospect of active defense as a way out of this is a remote and unlikely one. Anything's possible, but it's remote and unlikely. And that means that we have to go ahead trying to manage deterrence by the threat of retaliation.
But we must do it in ways that do not cause him to fear that we're holding our force not for deterrence, but for first strike. The great danger that the reason deterrence is unstable is that in a period of tension and crisis, one side or the other, believing the other side has the first strike capability, may be tempted to preempt, may be tempted to take the first step because, as horrible as that would be, it would be rationalized. It's better than taking a second step after the opponent has struck against you. That's the fear, that's the danger of today.
For 40 years, physicist Harold Agnew has seen firsthand what nuclear weapons can do. He watched the first bomb explode over Hiroshima. He ran the laboratory that developed today's warheads. Now he serves on a presidential panel studying future nuclear developments.
I'm convinced that unless a person has actually felt the heat, it's the heat, not the blast, not the flash, but the heat from a high-yield multi-megaton weapon, the danger of a person taking an action and saying, let's use nuclear weapons, will persist. Perhaps we ought to have a requirement suggestion that leaders of nuclear power states every 5 years or so witness, I've said in their underwear, a nuclear detonation, multi-megaton.
We end this hour where we began, in Hiroshima. It's not the same Hiroshima we saw after August 6, 1945. Not the one we carry in our memories, and perhaps on our consciences. Except for this Hiroshima Peace Park, there is very little here to remind one of 1945. Elsewhere, the Japanese seem determined to put the nightmare of nuclear destruction out of their mind's eye. Every August 6th, they float lanterns down the Ota River to remember those lost on that fateful day. There is an inscription in the park that reads, "Rest in peace. The mistake shall not be repeated." Well, mistake or not, there are few who would argue with the realization that the world was permanently changed in 1945. The very existence of life on Earth was made subject to human error, human anger, human frailties, and human madness. However, for better or for worse, so far we have met the test. But in a world where new forces of terrorism and irrationality are on the rise, new generations are going to have to struggle with the terrible, destructive force that remains the legacy of Hiroshima, 40 years after, and still counting. This is Walter Cronkite for CBS Reports. Good night.
This portion of CBS Reports was sponsored by Sun Company. At Sun, we believe putting our energy back into the community is just as important as getting it out. Where there's sun, there's energy.
When it's important, America turns to CBS News for objectivity, accuracy, reliability. Watch the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
It was the 1930s. The Great Depression was deep and devastating. And research engineer Chester Carlson was living from hand to mouth. But he had an idea he thought he could sell. It was for a machine that would make quick, inexpensive copies of office paperwork. In his New York kitchen, Carlson developed a new copying process he called electrophotography. More than 20 companies turned him away. It was after nearly a decade of searching that Chester Carlson finally found a buyer for his copying process. It was a company now known as Xerox. This is Eva Marie Saint with an American Portrait.
Communication is probably the biggest job we have and the biggest responsibility.
The Channel 11 News Team. Get it from a reliable source.
This is CBS.
We were on the track of the hottest